Slavery has existed throughout history, of course, in all parts of the world, and racism also exists everywhere. But in the history of our nation, slavery and racism became intertwined in an unusual way. We have a history of racial slavery, and our American views of race today and our problems with racism are products of this history. No surprise. Um, for example, here's the Roman philosopher Seneca writing to a friend. He says, "Treat your slaves the way you wish your master to treat you. You say, but I am not a slave. True, for now you are fortunate, but things change." And I like that quote because it reminds us that in the Roman Empire and in many other slave systems in the world, anyone could become a slave. It had nothing to do with your race. But in our American history, we have this thing called racial slavery. It's not unique. There are other examples in the world, but it's unusual. It's not just slavery in general. It's a specific kind of slavery. And to understand it, let's go back to the British strategy of colonization in the New World. They chose colonization, right? Now, what is a colony? A colony is a miniature version of your home civilization, which you build in a foreign place. So here's an image of the English gentry in the 18th century with their farm, their hunting, their consumer goods. So you build a miniature version of your own home in a foreign place. The Greeks did this, the Vikings did it. Let's contrast this for a minute with Spain's tributary empire. So up here, the green, the 13 colonies, these are our British colonies. This whole blue area, and actually this kind of Portuguese Brazil area too, we can think of more as this kind of tributary empire model. New Spain was not a miniature version of Spain. Spanish families did not move over to the Americas and set up little farms and towns just like back home in Andalusia or wherever. The Spaniards who came to the Americas were mostly young men, single guys, greedy for personal glory, for gold. They were wannabe knights, really, like Don Quixote jousting at windmills, only not so endearing or so quaint. They came to the Americas to play Lord of the Manor and Brawny Knight. They wanted to enslave and tyrannize over the Native Americans as their kind of peasants. And eventually they intermarry with these Native Americans, and a new society evolved with new customs, new laws, economic and social patterns, a kind of hybrid culture, something new. Now, our British colonies are totally different. Instead of single men, whole families come over, sometimes whole communities. And also there are some lone migrants like indentured servants too. But the colonies that they build here, Virginia, Massachusetts Bay, Pennsylvania, they're little miniature versions of England, little mini Europes, mini Englands. They have the same houses, the same farming patterns, townships, fashions, laws. They even have witch trials, right? Big surprise. And just like Europe, our colonial society is a white society. There's no room for intermarriage or cultural mixing with the Native Americans or the African slaves. Yes, people did intermarry sometimes, people being people. Of course that happened a lot. But it wasn't normal. It didn't fit into the system. It wasn't kind of an accepted part of the social structure here like it was in New Spain. And again, we can refer to New Spain for a contrast. There, we see a racially diverse society. Africans, Native Americans, and Europeans are all intermarrying, and this diversity is organized within a complex legal system called the Sistema de Castas. And that defined your legal status in New Spain. It defined your legal rights and your privileges based on your race. Here we have an image of the Sistema de Castas, the kind of different levels that people could be placed in legally based on their ethnicity, essentially. Based on whether your mother was part Native American and part African, or your father was part African and his father was part European. It was diverse, but also, of course, hierarchical. We have pure white Europeans at the top and pure Native Americans at the very bottom, and then a kind of complex list of all these different mixes in between. But in the British colonies, they don't do that. They simply replicate their all-white European social structures, and there's no room for diversity, really. Native Americans remain outsiders. They are separate sovereign nations. They're neighbors, they're trading partners, they're allies or enemies in war, but they're not members of colonial society. The same with the new United States, actually, when it's formed. Native Americans don't vote because they're not citizens. They're not members of the new nation. They're members of their own tribes. The African slaves, of course, are outsiders too in this colonial society. They're not part of the body politic. They have no rights. They're very rarely freed. They're born in slavery, they die in slavery, and their children are born slaves. They're separate. And only Africans are slaves. Well, a few Native Americans in the early years, but white colonists are never slaves. Indentured servitude is this whole other thing, totally different, we'll talk about later. So colonial society, as you can see, is defined by racial boundaries. Members of society are white, people outside society are not. And this racism intensifies over time. Partly this is because the colonists are obsessed with their liberties as British citizens, their natural and just rights, their equality before the law. And if those, if those ideas are at the center of your political culture, then how do you enslave millions of people if you believe in this, as Jefferson says, slaveholding Jefferson, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you believe that and you're willing to fight a revolution to secure those things for yourself, how is it possible that you can also hold millions of other people as slaves, like Jefferson did? Not, millions personally, but many of our founders were slaveholders also. How do you do that? Like, how is this what we would see as hypocrisy? How is that possible? Well, that's where you get racism. That's the only way it works. You have to have racism to be able to say this, all men are created equal, and still hold slaves. This is an English writer, famous lexicographer, Samuel Johnson, 1775, kind of during the heat of our revolutionary conflict, saying, "Why is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" And we'll see that word again all semester. I know it's disturbing, but it's a part of history. So this hypocrisy was not lost on everyone. So that's why we need racism, right? Racism is the only way you can do this while treating another group of people as subhuman. Racism allows you to justify it by saying essentially that this other group is naturally different. They're not like us. They're a different breed, a different species almost. Nature made them different. God made them different. It's not our fault. And to a large extent, this kind of anti-Black racism that develops in the colonies and then in the early United States, it was a result of racial slavery in the Americas, not its cause. Scholarly consensus is quite clear on this. There's wonderful scholarship on these issues. Racism against Africans, this kind of racism that we see develop here, it did not cause the Europeans to use the Africans as slaves. This really evolved, this kind of anti-Black racism really evolved during the colonial period as a way to justify keeping them as slaves after it had become so profitable that, they can't possibly give it up. So let's have a look at our map. Maps are great. This is showing the Atlantic trade networks during the colonial period. It's a great map. This is a network called the Atlantic System. So the Atlantic System, all this trade going on, and it's what economists would classify as a triangular trade system, a triangle trade, because it has three main points: Africa, Europe, and the Americas. So it's got three legs. A triangle can only exist if it has three sides, right? So what happens if we eliminate, for example, this leg, the slave trade? What if we just did away with the slave trade because it's obviously really unchristian and inhumane and awful? What if we just did away with that? Well, the whole triangle would collapse, everyone would lose tons of money. It would be really inconvenient, And there's always the argument, too, that at least if we're talking specifically about British colonists here as individuals, if they don't buy the African slaves, then the Brazilians will, the Spanish will, it's not like nobody else is gonna buy them. So we'll get a lot more into this topic of abolishing slavery later on. But you can kind of see how money is at the core of the growth of racism here through this racial slave system and the Atlantic trade system that it forms one foundation of. This whole economy couldn't exist without the African slave trade right here. So there's an ever-increasing incentive, if you will, to invest in this concept of racism. And we do see this happen throughout the colonial period. Stronger and stronger kind of black and white division in colonial society through laws, through lots of things, because that's the ideological foundation of the whole economy. So why did they start bringing African slaves to the Americas in the first place? Well, at first, of course, they just They meaning mostly the Spanish here, not the British, although the British did a tiny bit of this. They tried simply enslaving the Native Americans because, well, why not? They're there. But that didn't work. They kept dying. And then along comes this troublesome priest, Bartolome de las Casas. He is a real heroic figure in history. There aren't very many of them. He is one. I think we can think of him as the first humanitarian in history, many centuries before that word even existed. He publicizes and decries, and probably overstates, maybe a little bit sometimes, Spain's brutal enslavement and slaughter of the Native Americans. Here's an illustration from one of his works, just showing the horrors that the Native Americans were suffering. And he says, hey, why don't you guys buy African slaves instead, and stop killing these poor Native Americans? They're obviously not suited to this kind of hard labor. And everyone uses African slaves. Slavery is a major staple of the African economy. They enslave each other. Everyone uses African slaves. So stop killing Native Americans, get out your wallets and spend some money and buy some real slaves. That sounds awful to us, but in his context, it seemed like a solution to this kind of really awful thing that he personally witnessed. After all, we already talked about the Ottoman Empire and its involvement in the African slave trade. The Muslim world had been doing this for centuries. The African slave was a staple of their economy, arguably its main foundation. And they also had kind of a long tradition of dialogue about race and the people that they called the Zanj, who are the sub-Saharan Africans, basically, whom they used as slaves in this whole Indian Ocean region and this Muslim kind of world throughout the Middle Ages. Anyway, so that's how it started. Let's use African slaves because they don't die like the Native Americans do, and the slave trade, if you will, is already set up in Africa. Now, the Europeans did not go charging off into the jungles of Africa to capture slaves. They couldn't because they'd get diseases like malaria and they would die. Europeans can't actually go beyond the coasts of Africa until the late 19th century when they do figure out how to cure malaria. But the thing is, they don't need to go into Africa to hunt slaves. The Africans are very happy to do it for them. And as I said, this is already a major part of the African economy. Africans have been capturing and selling one another as slaves for many centuries, to each other and to the Muslims, of course. We need to think about the fact that the Africans here don't think of themselves as one united nation of Africans, of course. They're not Africans. They're Shona or Matabele or Ashanti. If I'm a Matabele, why shouldn't I enslave and sell my enemies, the Shona? They're my enemies. And when the European slave trader pays me in guns, I'm going to go out and capture even more slaves, right? So it's a vicious cycle, feeding on ancient tribal rivalries. Some African nations become incredibly powerful and wealthy by trading slaves. Here's an image from a Dutch map in the 17th century showing this West African port. And you can see Africans capturing and pulling around other Africans here. This is how the trade happened. So some nations become incredibly powerful by this new slave trade on the West. Some, of course, are totally decimated and almost wiped out. Some Africans even own sugar plantations out in the Atlantic Oceans here in these kind of Canary Islands and Madeira and whatnot. And they own slaves. And the ever-increasing demand for slaves to work the American plantations radically alters everything in West Africa, as you might imagine. Social, political, economic dynamics. One slave, Olaudah Equiano, his memoir is in our primary source anthology. It's a really amazing read. Anyway, this guy, he remembers being captured by slave catchers as a child, by African slave catchers, of course, and he recalls that in his village, children always chose somebody to stand guard while they played to warn them of kidnappers, of slave catchers. So that was like normal for him. When you go out and play, make sure that somebody is standing guard for slave catchers. And I think that's a really horrifying illustration of how this Atlantic slave trade impacted West African life for ordinary people. And who is being enslaved? Is it the old and sick? No, right? It's the young and strong. 8 to 10 million of them every year at the height of the trade. and about 3/4 of these are young men. So this has a terrible impact on the region's demographics, basically taking away their healthiest members of society every year. Now, the slave's journey across the Atlantic here is called the Middle Passage, and it's so horrible I can't even imagine it. It took anywhere from 4 to 10 weeks in the tropical heat. This is right along the equator. Well, a little north, but, close to it. Tropical heat, really awful. Just appallingly inhumane, filthy, violent conditions. The death rate was 10 to 20% for the crews and for the slaves. And these ships got so disgusting, they were often burned and sunk after a few voyages because you just couldn't even bear to go near them anymore. They smelled so disgusting. Here's how one slave remembers his journey to Brazil in the 1840s. We were thrust into the hold of the vessel in a state of nudity. Just the dehumanizing element is always here in these accounts of this racial slavery. The males being crammed on one side and the females on the other. The hold was so low. In other words, the ceiling, the compartment was so low we couldn't stand up. We had to crouch on the floor or sit down. Day and night were the same, sleep being denied us by the confined position of our bodies. We became desperate through suffering and fatigue, and the dead were simply thrown overboard. There are many such accounts. And this is a plan of a diagram of a British slave ship. Okay, so it's really awful. And you have to have racism to justify treating people like this. Just say, oh, it's natural. We can see from the map here, this is a fascinating map, I think, about 1/3 of the slaves go to Brazil, Portuguese Brazil, big sugar plantations here. And Brazil is the largest slave economy in the Americas, and it's the last to abolish slavery, not till the 1880s. Most slaves go to Brazil or to the Caribbean, the Sugar Islands. This is the most valuable real estate in the Americas, right here, the Sugar Islands, because sugar is the moneymaker. That is definitely where the money is. Only about 6% go to the British colonies, some of the British Sugar Islands, like the Bahamas, Jamaica, Bermuda, Barbados, and, out of that 6%, 4% wind up going up here. So not many actually go there. And yeah, I think that's it for now. We will take up this topic of slavery many times throughout the semester, but at least now we kind of have a feel for the foundations of it, hopefully within a global perspective.